Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Heretics podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order at the Morris Winchevsky Center. We are a secular, progressive Canadian Jewish organization that has been around since the 1920s. We are a multifaceted cultural and activist community with a summer camp. It's called Camp Nijveld. We have a shula, or school, for children and adults, an extensive Yiddish archive and other things, and branches in different Canadian cities. My name is David Wall, and I am the United Jewish People's Order cultural programmer. That's a mouthful. And I will be your host today. This is actually our first ever episode. I guess it's called the pilot episode. And our first ever interviewee, our first ever guinea pig is the great Max Wallace. And now I will attempt to summarize the entirety of Max Wallace's life and career in one paragraph, and I will fail dismally, but here goes. Max Wallace is an activist, author, historian, filmmaker, broadcaster, and music festival director, among other things. His nonfiction books have garnered numerous nominations and awards and appearances on prominent bestseller lists, including that of the New York Times. His books are wonderfully diverse in content, with subjects ranging from Nazi-sympathizing aviator Charles Lindbergh to rock star Kurt Cobain. And if we were to just read some of the titles of his books, we will see just how diverse his subject matter is. For example, he wrote The American Axis, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, and the Rise of the Third Reich. He wrote In the Name of Humanity, The Secret Deal to End the Holocaust. This book, by the way, was a finalist for the prestigious RBC Taylor Prize for Nonfiction in 2018. Max wrote Love and Death, The Murder of Kurt Cobain. And he wrote Muhammad Ali's Greatest Fight, Cassius Clay versus the United States of America. This book, written in 2000, was adapted into a movie and directed by the great Stephen Frears, the man who brought us Dangerous Liaisons and other films, and it starred Danny Glover and Christopher Plummer. His latest book, called After the Miracle, focuses on the under-celebrated left-wing radicalism of Helen Keller, and hopefully we'll be discussing this book today at some length. I'm not done yet. Over the years, Max managed to co-found and direct the Ottawa Folk Festival. He worked as station manager at the community radio station CKCU-FM. He worked for Steven Spielberg's Shoah Project. He made a wonderful film called Schmelvis about Elvis Presley's Jewish roots. And he's made a difference as a disability advocate by, among other things, writing video descriptions of content for a television network dedicated to the visually impaired. Oh wait, there's one significant thing I didn't include, and that is his connection to the Morris Winchevsky United Jewish People's Order community. He's a Nijveld cottage owner and serves on at least one board of directors in the organization. But we'll get to all of that later. Phew, I'm done. Welcome, Max Wallace. How are you today?
I'm feeling old with that description.
Well, it's a kind of description that it could be like your obituary. He died.
Exactly.
But you've done some incredible stuff. Did I get anything egregiously wrong? I'm not an ace researcher like you.
Oh, it's all a blur basically, but it sounds right.
I could have made up stuff, I guess. So we'll just dive right in. As you heard in the intro, this is our first ever podcast episode, and I think the point of this podcast, at least for now, until it changes, is kind of looking at different ways of expressing secularist and or progressive Jewishness. So I would like to ask about your Jewish identity. Did you, for example, grow up in an observant context?
I definitely did not. In fact, my grandfather was the first vice president of the United Jewish People's Order Canada and the president of UJPO Montreal. And that's at a time that's something you didn't mention in your introduction, but figures very prominently in my Jewish upbringing, but also in the the book about Helen Keller, UJPO was for many years a communist front organization, and was quite notorious in the Toronto and Canadian Jewish communities for its affiliation with the Communist Party. It's long since abandoned that affiliation, but in some people's minds, we're still, a bunch of commies. And I was brought up very secular. Needless to say, my parents weren't communists, but my mother was a red diaper baby, and I guess I was, militantly secular growing up, but I did have a strong sense of my Jewish identity and this idea that Judaism and social justice are inextricably linked. So that's what really appealed to me about UJPO when I moved to Toronto. The UJPO chapters in Montreal and other cities had long since disbanded, and Toronto and Winnipeg are really the only chapters left. But I grew up hearing about UJPO. My mother was a red diaper baby. She went to the Maurice Winchevsky School in Montreal, which was UJPO Montreal was padlocked by Duplessis, by the fascist premier of Quebec.
Wow.
When she was a child. And the Maurice Winchevsky Shola ended up in her parents' living room, not because it was closed down, but because so many parents pulled their kids out because of that taint of communism. So, I'd heard about all this, but when I moved to Toronto about almost 20 years ago, I found my community.
I recently attended the Limud Festival, which is this kind of international Jewish education convention kind of, and there was
Right.
one in Toronto, and I actually attended representing UJPO, representing the United Jewish People's Order, and I had a discussion with one of the organizers of the event, and he had a kippah on. He was clearly an observant Jewish man, and he just basically came out and asked me, I mean, he was being facetious a little bit, but I could tell there was a kernel of truth in it. He said, what's the point of calling yourself Jewish if you're not religious? What's the point of it? Why not just be left wing? Why does it? What's the Jewish part? In other words, he was asking, what is the essence of secular Judaism, secular Jewishness? Why bother? How would it? I sort of had my answer, but how would you answer that question?
Well, ironically, for my last book, which you mentioned, In the Name of Humanity, it was focused on an ultra-Orthodox woman named Resha Sternbach, who was a hero of the Holocaust. And so when I started doing my research, I ended up a lot in Brooklyn with this huge Haredi ultra-Orthodox community. And I grew up, I'd say a lot of secular Jews in my family were borderline anti-Semitic. They would talk about these, black-hatted Orthodox Jews with almost repugnance. They would, they were embarrassed. And I sort of understand. My mother grew up in Montreal, which is still quite anti-Semitic, but when she was young, it was much worse. Quebec being sort of the epicenter of anti-Semitism in North America. Now it's more Islamophobic which is a relief to the Jewish community, but there's still a lot of intolerance there. And then I didn't know what to expect. I grew up with these myths about the Haredi and the Hasidic Jews, and then I immersed myself for a couple of years in that community. And I also wondered, would they accept me? Do they even consider me Jewish? And, they'd always say the same thing. They'd use the same phrase over and over. Yid's a Yid. What do we care? And so I have encountered this idea, especially from modern Orthodox, these people in Toronto who wear the kippah, and have a great deal of contempt for secular Jews. And I think it's sort of more of a recent phenomenon too in the modern Orthodox community, that secular Jews are associated with left-wing Jews. Left-wing Jews are a bunch of Israel haters and anti-Zionists. And so to them, what they're really saying is that, you're not Jewish because you don't embrace Zionism the way we do.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it's also, maybe we'll touch on this a little later, because Helen Keller has had a relationship with Israel, but all roads seem to lead there. All our conversations as Jewish people seem to lead somehow to Israel and Zionism and that whole that whole kind of wormhole, as it were.
Right. And as I discovered, and as we could talk about with Helen Keller, the same was true, 70, 80 years ago, but a very different attitude towards Israel on the left, especially.
That's right. So I want to let's just dive into talking about your books, and I'm going to do that annoying thing where I'm going to try to encapsulate your entire output with an annoying or a sort of a trite metaphor. But I think I look at your books and there's like two rivers. It's like it's split in two. Your oeuvre is split in two, kind of. So there's the historian Holocaust research aspect of your stuff, and then there's a sort of pop culture aspect. And there's some places where they meet. For example, the book about Charles Lindbergh, he was a pop culture phenomenon, but he was also, a horrible anti-Semite and American fascist. And so the question I have is about passion. There's a cliche, which is, okay, maybe Max is writing the stuff about Kurt Cobain in order to make a lot of money so he can have time to do the stuff he really wants to do, which is all his research into Jewish history and anti-Semitic history and the Holocaust and all the serious stuff. Are you equally passionate about these different strains? How did you end up with this kind of dichotomy?
Well, the Kurt Cobain stuff, I used to be a music journalist, and I was station manager of Canada's largest alternative radio station. So that wasn't so weird back then that I was, doing books about these conspiracy theories around the death of Kurt Cobain. But now, that I have an entire oeuvre, as you call it, I've realized that there's a common theme to a lot of my books and a lot of my subjects, the idea of these icons. So I've written a lot about icons, Kurt Cobain, Muhammad Ali, Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, now Helen Keller. And I've always been, I never write about, what they're famous for. It's really what they did with their fame, either for the negative with Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford, both Nazi sympathizers, or somebody like Muhammad Ali. I had no interest in his boxing career, but my book was about his stand against the Vietnam War and how influential he was at the time and how much he risked. And he used his fame, he used his iconic status to make a political stand. And so, and this continues with Helen Keller. We could talk about it, but that's another. I'm not really writing in my book about her what she's famous for, being a famous deafblind person. Mm-hmm. It's really what she did with that fame that struck me, and that I really focus on in this book.
So the latest book, called After the Miracle, is about the lesser-known later life of Helen Keller. So you talk about your fascination with icons. Why Helen Keller? What led you to her? And I understand it coincides with your work advocating for the disabled. Here's an interesting question. Does it connect at all to your Jewishness?
Absolutely. Ironically, and this is almost a coincidence or an accident, I first come across Helen Keller when I'm researching Henry Ford's Nazi sympathies. And in the 1920s, Henry Ford buys a weekly newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and launches the most sustained hate campaign in American history, sort of a precursor to a lot of what's going on today. He spends 7 years in this newspaper blaming Jews for all the evils of American society. And, I'm in the archives in Dearborn, Michigan, going back and in real time researching, how people reacted at the time to this anti-Semitic hate crusade. And I come across Helen Keller. Helen Keller is one of the first prominent Americans to speak out very loudly against this anti-Semitic crusade. She wasn't Jewish. I'm like, what? All I knew about Helen Keller was what everybody else knows about Helen Keller. You know, I read The Story of My Life in grade school, and you know, most of what I knew focused on Helen as a 6-year-old girl at the water pump and her miraculous teacher. And so that was interesting. And then years later, I'm researching the book burnings, the very famous book burnings that sort of signaled the beginning of Hitler's, right after Hitler came to power. German students burned books, un-German books, mostly, you know, Jews and intellectuals and un-German decadent figures that were enemies of the new Reich, of the new order. And I come across Helen Keller's book being one of the first burned, and she's one of the few Americans that are chosen by the Nazis for eradication. And that was interesting. And that's, I think, when I did a little deeper dive into Helen Keller. You know, how is this beloved icon arousing the ire of the world's most ruthless dictator? And I realized it's her socialism, right? Did I know she was a socialist? No. And so that fascinated me. That really started me on the path. But again, these are two, you know, areas where I'm focusing on Jewish themed topics, and I come across Helen Keller, this, you know, Christian Gentile figure that's not associated with that stuff in any way.
Wow, that's amazing.
And so here I am. Yeah.
One interesting aspect of the Keller story that you really do go into in the book in a great way is the way in which her persona has been edited to hide her radicalism. It reminded me of the way that Martin Luther King's persona has been co-opted across the board by left and right to become this kind of benign figure of, quote, peace, unquote, but as opposed to his actual kind of anti-poverty, anti-capitalist work, especially later in his life. Can you talk to this erasure in relation to Helen Keller? And it seems it's complicated because you talk in the book about how she did some self-censoring at certain points in order to not sabotage her work for the blind.
She was an accomplice in this erasure, right? But she was surrounded by these figures, her literary consultants and her employer, the American Foundation for the Blind, who every time she tried to take a political stand, a controversial or a radical stand, they would exert immense pressure, almost emotional blackmail on her to downplay this because she has a responsibility to the blind community and the deaf community. And this type of her radical beliefs are going to jeopardize that. And, you know, she succumbed to that on many an occasion, but then, you know, it would be like whack-a-mole. She'd come right back, especially even during the Cold War in the 50s. She's denouncing Joe McCarthy. And throughout her life, there's this idea, and that she joins the Socialist Party in around 1909, 1910. And she's a very active, very radical socialist for about 12 years. And then she gets a job with the American Foundation for the Blind. And that's the end of her. She's no longer talking about revolution. She's no longer talking about the perils of capitalism. And so there's this idea. There have been documentaries and other biographies that talk about her early socialism, but there's this idea that she, once she went to work for the AFB, she became apolitical. Her politics had mellowed. She no longer was, you know, a radical socialist and had these left-wing beliefs. That's simply not true. That's the part that's mostly been erased. I mean, most people don't even know she was a socialist, but those that do, there's this myth, and the myth's been perpetuated by people who should know better. You know, documentary filmmakers and biographers who probably believe that you know, it's okay. It's sort of quaint that she was once a socialist. But later on, she embraces the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution. And for about 30, 35 years, she's a very strong supporter of Soviet-style communism. And that's the part that's really been erased. That's what most troubled me. Not the idea that her early socialism has been erased, but these people that have talked about her most famous biographer, Joseph Lash, wrote a biography, the first definitive biography in 1980, and he talks about how she was duped by the communists, because you can't ignore some of, her book is burned by the Nazis in May 1933. Just after the Nazis take power, most people have no idea what's happening in Germany and haven't even heard of Hitler. But she spends the rest of the decade as a fierce anti-fascist and anti-Nazi activist. She right after her book is burned, she writes a letter to Hitler, warning him that you can burn my book, but you can't erase my beliefs. And she says in May 1933, she writes, "Do not think that your barbarities towards the Jews are unknown here." This is before the Nuremberg laws. This is before the Holocaust. It's a few months after Hitler takes power, and she's already talking about his barbarities to the Jews, because she spoke fluent German. She spoke 6 languages. And so she was reading German periodicals and following in real time the rise of Hitler and the kind of things that he was saying and planning to do. But most of this stuff most German Jews had no idea what was coming. And yet here's Helen Keller, in May 1933, warning Hitler. And then for the rest of the decade, 2 other books, one of her books gets censored because she's praising Lenin. She writes a second autobiography called Midstream, and she's talking about the seed that Lenin has sowed for all mankind. So that's censored in Germany. She's very popular in Germany. In fact, during World War I, she devoted all her German royalties to the German soldiers blind at the front. Her friends, even some of her socialist comrades, thought that she favored Germany over the Western Allies. So her book gets censored. And then in 1938, she publishes her journal. And in the journal, which had started a couple of years earlier, it really shows the depth of her knowledge about the political currents in Europe and the rise of fascism. She's consistently talking about, she's prophesizing events years in the future. She's predicting that Hitler is going to ally with Mussolini and with Japan to subjugate the Soviet Union. She talks about meetings between Hitler and Franco, and it describes it as a conspiracy alarmingly imminent. So she's predicting. She becomes a very fierce anti-fascist and supporter of the loyalist forces in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And she starts to travel with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to raise money for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade was founded by the Communist International. It was a communist organization, but also, very anti-fascist. And so I started to think that she was the original Antifa before Antifa was a pejorative word on the right? She spent the 30s just warning people about fascism and about Nazism. And she's writing letters to her friends at the New York Times, criticizing the New York Times for failing to pay attention to Hitler's crimes. And the New York Times was owned by Jews. And so even Jewish media were sort of downplaying what was happening in Germany. And she was reading these German periodicals and following it very closely, and was desperate to get people to pay attention. She starts to, in one of her journal entries, she talks about how she had been placed on a Nazi blacklist, the list of figures to be sent to a concentration camp. So they were paying attention as well. it's this famous figure. You know, she wasn't known to be a communist. She was still this beloved figure that had potentially a lot of influence among mainstream America and the rest of the world. So it seems that they considered her a threat, which was interesting, right? It was fascinating to me. I mean, I've become a Holocaust historian, and here's this figure. I had no idea any of this stuff, and these little hints as I'm researching.
So yeah, I mean, she's a full-on radical, and but then correct me if I'm wrong, but she sort of changes a bit once there's a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany. She kind of, for a while at least, toes the party line, unquote, and becomes a little bit less vociferous, a little bit less anti-Nazi, because that's what the Soviet Union has demanded of its party followers. Isn't that true?
Which is the dirty little secret of the left, of my own family, of my own communist grandparents, and even of UJPO, right? Like, this is a Jewish organization that was once a communist front. And unfortunately, the majority of Jewish communists in 1939, after the non-aggression pact, they were ordered to stop criticizing Hitler. And because now Stalin and Hitler were allies. And so, they had just spent years warning of the dangers of fascism, the typhus of fascism. And suddenly they're ordered to stop criticizing Hitler. And, this is a little bit troubling. I actually interviewed, there's the grand dame of UJPO, of the Jewish People's Order, was a woman named Razu Ziskin, who had been president of Winnipeg. She was a very formidable, amazing figure. She just died a few months ago. But before she died, I had the opportunity to sit down with her, and I asked her that. She was about 95 when she died. And so she remembered this. I never had the opportunity to ask my grandmother about this period, but I asked her whether she remembers the non-aggression pact. And it turns out that she had communist relatives, and she was old enough at the time. She was about 8 or 9 years old, and she'd been raised as a red diaper baby. And she looks on bemused as her communist relatives are forced to stop criticizing Hitler. And she asks them about it. And they tell her that Stalin needs time to arm himself for the inevitable war. So these are, people rationalizing at the time. We now know that Stalin was an ignorant buffoon. He actually trusted Hitler, much like a lot of Western allies when they appeased him, and yet they rationalized it, and it's a cautionary tale. That's the real lesson. This idea that if you forget history, you're condemned to repeat it. We're seeing this now with Putin and Ukraine. There's a lot of people on the far left, including many communists. You could fit a meeting of the Communist Party in a phone booth these days. But when you read their literature, they're defending the invasion and talking about how Russia was provoked by NATO. Yeah. Right? We none of us like NATO, of course, right? And we certainly know NATO's history and what NATO's capable of. But this is preposterous. This idea, right? But and then the invasion of Ukraine came as I was researching this book, so I'm seeing all these parallels.
Do you have a definitive opinion about her dedication to Soviet Russia and how it changed over time? Do you get a sense of where she ended up? Or was some of that, and it's one thing that I found confusing, it wasn't your fault in the book, but it's just the sort of history. Was her seeming change of heart about Stalin, was that related to the sort of self-censoring around her advocacy for the blind, or was she really changing? Because at one point she sort of says, "I'm not a communist." Was that true?
Right. She actually gives an interview to the New York Times in 1950. A lot of left-wingers were starting to do this around then. She describes communism as tyranny in the New York Times, and there was immense pressure on her from everybody around her, and the Cold War was in full force at this time. And so was this disingenuous? It does sound a little bit disingenuous. We know that she was never a fan of Stalin. She considered Lenin the greatest living figure. Even when he was alive, she was on a vaudeville tour, and people would ask her, "Who do you consider the greatest man in the world?" And she'd always say Lenin. So, later on, she compared Stalin and Lenin and said Stalin doesn't have the same breadth of genius and vision as Lenin. So she was never a fan of Stalin. And yet, even as she was criticizing Stalin and troubled by his purges and by some of the hypocrisy that she was already seeing, she also saw the Soviet Union and communism, Bolshevism, as a very important thing. So going back to the beginning, to the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, you have her friend Emma Goldman writes a letter. I find this letter from Emma Goldman to Helen Keller now. One's a socialist, one's an anarchist. And Emma Goldman writes, "Is not Russia the promised land?" They were thrilled. The entire breadth of the left at this time during the Russian Revolution, the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, there weren't very many communists yet because they were still mostly socialists. And they see this incredible potential. They see, you see it in real time, like they're all celebrating the Russian Revolution. And as the revolution proceeds, through the 20s and through the 30s, this actually made an impression on me. You have Helen Keller consistently defending the Soviet Union. And even after she's criticizing Stalin, and you start doing the math, and she's talking about, in letters to friends, look at how much the Soviet Union has accomplished in a short 15 years. And she starts itemizing the incredible progress they've made. And it really is astonishing. I never really thought of it that way, right? Like that, this revolution 15 years earlier, 25 years earlier, in that period of time, they had accomplished so much. And, Jews certainly were celebrating because there was, before Stalin showed himself to be a rabid anti-Semite, there was a lot of progress. The Jews that had been targeted by pogroms and by vicious anti-Semitism for their entire lives suddenly were welcomed into Soviet society. There were Jewish cabinet ministers in Stalin's cabinet, and so this was a miracle to people. And now we know in hindsight what a brutal monster Stalin was and his crimes. But people didn't really know that at the time, even as Keller is criticizing the purges and the Moscow show trials. She still sees this great hope in the Soviet Union and almost rationalizes it. Yes, but Russia has its flaws. Russia is making mistakes, but look at what's happening in Nazi Germany. So she's consistently comparing Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And it does come out much better, understandably. So it's quite fascinating to me just reading this stuff in real time, the letters and the journal as it's progressing. I had a better sense of how my grandparents rationalized it and what they were looking at. Now, she had been a socialist, and then she at one point after the Russian Revolution, she describes herself as a socialist and a Bolshevik, and she starts comparing socialism and communism. A lot of people are still confused about this. What's the difference? She's a member of the Socialist Party, and she starts to criticize the Socialist Party as being too slow, especially around World War I. The Socialist Party was against the war, but she wanted a general strike. She goes to Carnegie Hall. That's how Emma Goldman discovers her. Emma Goldman attends a talk that she gives at Carnegie Hall under a new women's party calling for a general strike. And the Socialist Party, not wanting to alienate the unions, rejects it. The unions all want a war. The American unions know that it will create thousands and thousands and thousands of good-paying jobs. So she becomes disgusted with the Socialist Party. And then once the Russian Revolution happens, it's very clear. She tells a reporter that she's now a socialist and a Bolshevik. And she starts to embrace syndicalism. She joins the IWW, and she starts to describe herself as an IWW. She had followed the Lawrence textile strike. Big Bill Haywood. Big Bill Haywood becomes her hero, and he's the main figure behind the industrial workers of the world. And so she starts to embrace syndicalism and left-wing socialist politics. I don't know how many people remember the movie Reds, which is now decades ago. It's about John Reed. John Reed, the journalist, the socialist journalist who goes to Russia, befriends or gets to know Trotsky and Lenin, and he writes 10 Days That Shook the World, the sort of definitive accounts of the Russian Revolution in the West, in English. And he's a friend of Helen Keller, and he doesn't know how to get back. He doesn't have the money to get back from Russia. She sends him the money. So she's a friend of John Reed at this time, and she's very influential in his career. And so John Reed returns to the United States and tries to convince the Socialist Party to embrace Bolshevism. And this is where the split happens. A significant portion of the Socialist Party wants to achieve socialism through the ballot box. And the left-wing faction, they're actually called the left-wing faction. John Reed is the leader of this left-wing faction, trying to get them to embrace the Bolshevik revolution and Bolshevism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so then thousands of socialists get expelled from the Socialist Party, and they end up founding 3 new communist parties, which eventually end up becoming one, the Communist Party of the USA. Helen Keller is clearly in the left-wing faction, and she's disgusted with the Socialist Party. She talks about how we need revolution. She's impatient. She doesn't believe in achieving socialism through the ballot box. So I'm doing this research, and it's quite fascinating and very confusing. You know, I remember when I watched Reds, I didn't really understand what was going on with, when he's addressing these large crowds. Now I have a better sense. But I'd always heard that UJPO, the United Jewish People's Order, had been expelled from the Jewish socialist movement, the Arbeiter Ring, the Workmen's Circle. So originally, the Labor League, which was the predecessor of UJPO, were members of this socialist Jewish group, very Yiddishist. And they end up advocating a segment of these Labor League members, especially women that work in the Shmada factories. They start to look at the Russian Revolution and what's happening in the Soviet Union, and they're trying to convince the Arbeiter Ring, these socialists, to embrace communism, to embrace Bolshevism, and they get expelled. So I'd always heard that that UJPO was the left wing of the Arbeiter Ring, and I always thought, left wing aren't socialists left wing as well? But they were actually pejoratively called the left wing, and they were expelled. And that's how UJPO came to be. That's how it became a communist front. And so when you look at Helen Keller's attitudes around this time, it's fascinating, the differences between socialism and communism. Yeah. Some are subtle, but the one thing that really struck me, and that's very prominently featured in the book, was her commitment to eradicating anti-Black racism.
Yes.
She spent her life, she grew up in Alabama. Her father was the first Klansman in Alabama. So she's raised by a Klansman, former Klansman, and she starts to become aware of these, the inequality very early on. And she sends a very poignant letter and a donation to the NAACP, the very fledgling NAACP, very, very early in the organization's history. She sends a letter talking about her shame of being from the South because of the oppression and the tears of African Americans. And this sent shockwaves through both the South and her own conservative family. How could she betray her heritage that way? And so for the rest of her life, she starts to embrace, she really takes on the anti-racist movement. And at one point I realized that she actually was a lot more passionate about anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism than she was about civil rights for people with disabilities.
Yeah, that comes out in the book for sure. It's an
Yeah.
interesting...
And so it turns out that the socialists were refusing to acknowledge that Black people were had it worse than white working class. So working class Blacks and working class whites were in it together. The evil was the oppression of the working man, the working class, not about Blacks. Now, they were anti-racism. They talked about how terrible racism was, but they refused to acknowledge that anti-Black racism was a bigger scourge. Meanwhile, the Communist Party, and this is where it becomes interesting, and I get a better insight into Ujpo's history, into my own grandparents' embrace of communism back then. Communist Party was leading was among the vanguard, opposing both anti-Black racism in the United States, anti-lynching laws. And it was a very important focus of their ideology, especially before the Second World War. And so later on, there's Ujpo has this long history with Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was a communist, a very famous actor and singer, but he was also a very prominent communist who never abandoned communism until his dying day. And he was one of the leaders of the anti-lynching movement. So I don't know a lot about Ujpo's history during the 30s when it was a communist front. The Labor League was a communist front, but I could see the appeal. You see it in Helen Keller. She's a socialist, and she realizes that we have to end anti-Black racism. So she starts to embrace the communist line about racism rather than the socialist line. And I can imagine that that's what drew Paul Robeson to Ujpo. And why, he came very often to Ujpo. He sang with the choir, the Toronto Jewish Folk Choir, which was prominently associated with our organization. And they must have been very active. We know that Ujpo was very active in supporting the Loyalist forces during the Spanish Civil War. So they were certainly active against fascism, which makes sense for a Jewish organization. But they were also clearly active in the anti-racist movement. And so you see these parallels.
It's interesting. It's almost like the communist faction, or what is referred to as the left faction of the left, was in a way predicting what we now call intersectionality, the idea that people have different experiences based on different kinds of oppression, which is fascinating to me. I do have a question related to that later. We are running out of time, but let me ask you just part of your book that's really fascinating is your exploration of Helen Keller's flaws.
So yes, she did have flaws, and I do talk about it. So like many socialists, she very briefly embraced eugenics.
Yeah, even calling for. There's a part that's shocking to me where she sort of embraces this idea that Can you talk about this thing that happened? They're like, no, we should let this baby die.
Right. So a doctor, it's the Bollinger baby in Chicago, and a doctor who was a very staunch eugenicist lets this baby die, a baby that was born with severe birth defects. And Helen Keller, you would expect her as a disability icon to condemn this, but instead she embraces it. And, it turns out that back then, a lot of socialists embraced, including Keller's friend, Margaret Sanger, her very close friend and ally. Margaret Sanger was a socialist, and she was a staunch eugenicist. And they would talk about how eugenics is necessary to eradicate overpopulation and poverty. So Helen Keller's two greatest, she had this great hatred for poverty. She called poverty an abomination, and for racism and discrimination. So eugenics to her would eradicate this misery that she saw. She traveled, she toured the slums, she knew the toll of poverty, especially poverty among blind and deaf racial minorities. She made a special point to talk about that, rather than, her employer wanted to give tax breaks to blind people so that they could get a tax break for buying a Braille typewriter. She had no interest in that. She couldn't have cared less. She'd write letters saying, no, that will only benefit a small portion of the disabled community, people like you and me who can afford it, but the overwhelming majority of blind and deaf people are poor and don't pay taxes. So she quickly rejects that. It's definitely a flaw, but it's very short-lived, either because she realized the hypocrisy, but she never embraced eugenics again. And then later on in the 30s, as I talked about, she very loudly condemns the Nazis for, that we know that the Nazis were inspired by the American and British eugenic movements. So she's, this time she places herself on the right side of history as a disability icon, and she condemns Hitler's euthanasia program.
So towards the end of the book, you discuss trends and attitudes among advocates for the disabled, especially in regards to identity politics, ideas of privilege, and a desire to even abandon Helen Keller as being too white, too privileged, too antiquated.
Yeah, a lot of disability advocates still, focus on that embrace of eugenics and say, well, Helen Keller is a white privileged woman. There's nothing radical about her, but because they don't know this story, that's part of it. I befriended a very well-known deafblind woman, an Ethiopian American named Helen Keller, who was the first deafblind person to earn a Harvard law degree, and she came out on the 140th anniversary of Helen Keller's death. She did a video for her huge social media following, talking about how Helen Keller was a hero. She would have, if she were alive today, she would embrace Black Lives Matter. She talked about privilege. And so there's starting to be a turnaround, and I'm hoping my book will contribute to that. This idea that, yes, she had flaws like a lot of people, but she did so much good. And you talked about intersectionality. Her epiphany was when she discovered that most disability in America was caused by a lack of workplace safety. So she started linking disability to capitalism. Mm-hmm. And she starts to link disability and race and feminism. She's a suffragette. She calls herself, she gives an interview to the New York Times, and she says, I'm a militant suffragette for one reason. I believe that suffragism will lead to socialism, and socialism is the ideal cause. Mm-hmm. So she's making all these connections. Today we call it intersectionality. But in the beginning of when disability studies programs started to be a thing in the 60s and 70s, they weren't talking about that. It's only recently that became part of the curriculum of disability studies programs. And yet a lot of prominent academics condemned Helen Keller because for 2 or 3 weeks, she embraced eugenics. Meanwhile, she was an intersectionalist long before it was a word.
Absolutely amazing that she's incredibly prophetic and ahead of her time. That's a sense I get over and over reading your fascinating book. It's really remarkable, and I would recommend everyone pick up a copy of After the Miracle by Max Wallace, because the book After the Miracle is about Helen Keller, but also it's kind of like a primer on the history of American radicalism, the history of the left in a particular time. And it's fascinating. So Israel was almost a Soviet-oriented entity when it began, and Helen Keller was interested in it, seems to have been interested in it for that reason.
Right. Most socialists embraced Zionism in the 20s and 30s. And of course, the first Labor government, or Mapai government, were a bunch of socialists. David Ben-Gurion, those people, and of course, like a lot of socialists, there was a lot of hypocrisy in it. But at that time, there was this mythology, and there's a letter that she sends to one of her comrades about how after she visited Israel in 1952, she talks about her visit, and she had also visited South Africa a year earlier, where she was disgusted by 3 years after apartheid. She was disgusted by the racial segregation, and she had to, give separate talks to Black groups and white groups and colored groups and Indian groups. And she's talking about this to her comrade, and he says, "Oh, what a contrast to Israel, where there's no discrimination of any kind," right? And you're reading that's what they believe. They genuinely believe that Israel become this manifestation of socialism and even communism. And of course, Stalin endorsed the creation of the state of Israel early on in 1948, and it's only later that Israel becomes a pariah among the left. But here she is in the 30s talking about Palestine, and there's actually a tinge of bigotry in her talks, because she's talking about the Arabs have really not achieved what the Jews have achieved. She's basically saying the Jews are much more civilized than the Arabs. So I think this was this was part of that socialist line back then, that we need to create a state of Israel as a socialist paradise. And we need to, put the Arabs back in their place, because they're the obstacle. So, another one of her flaws, for sure, especially when she's, so vocal about anti-Black racism and her disgust for anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. And here you see her with a little bigoted diatribe about the Arabs. She changes once she visits Israel, and once she visits the Middle East or a slew of Arab countries. She starts to change her attitude. She visits Syria, and she's impressed by how more women than men attend university. So that's also short-lived.
Certainly, when I read your book, and I have a feeling a lot of people reading this book are going to fall in love with Helen Keller. I don't know if that was your intent, but that's what happens. I fall in love with Helen Keller, and anyone you fall in love with, you recognize that they have flaws. But one of the things that Helen Keller manages is to be mutable. She changes. She learns. Her political positions. She's not stuck in. She's not stubborn. She's able to evolve her politics. And so I like to think maybe she would have grown up, as it were, to maybe have a more nuanced look at Israel as an.
Oh, I know for sure that that's true. If she, like Habengirma said, if she was alive today, she would be supporting Black Lives Matter, but she would also be a very fierce critic of the Israeli government and the crimes of the Israeli government towards the Palestinian people. There's no question in my mind. I also fell in love with her. That's probably why you did, because that's how I wrote the book. Even though, I definitely document a lot of her flaws, but I have absolutely no doubt. Just like I know that she would be a very vocal opponent of Donald Trump and Trumpism and what's going on in the United States. She actually described one of her critics, a columnist named Westbrook Pegler, outed her as a communist sympathizer in 1947, and she described him as a dung beetle, which has become my favorite epithet. And so I could just picture Helen Keller describing Donald Trump as a dung beetle.
All right, well, that's a perfect place to stop. Let's leave it there. Donald Trump as a dung beetle. Thank you so much, Max, for giving up so much of your time to talk to me, and I'll see you soon and talk to you soon as we put on our hats as members of the Ujpo Winchevsky community.
Thanks for having me. It was an auspicious honor to be the inaugural guinea pig for your podcast. Good luck with the podcast.
Thank you so much. Stay well.
You too.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin and our guest, Max Wallace. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name is David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.